Hello. So glad you could make it, despite the fact that it's almost dark out there and very scary. So this is Art Matters, and we're so delighted to have Matthew Robb here. He's chief curator at the Fowler at UCLA. And probably a little known fact is that we actually do have a collection of pre-Columbian objects in our permanent collection, which is much vaster and more varied than most people, I think, suspect. That's something that we hope to correct with the reinstallation of the newly renovated galleries next year. So you will see a variety of objects, including some more non-Western. Pre-Columbian and African will be integrated, and I'm working on that right now. So I have the delight of being responsible for parts of the collection about which I know absolutely nothing. This happens as an accident of being a small museum, but I am responsible for pre-1945, including everything else that nobody wants to curate. And that means that I have to rely on my friends, and fortunately, I happen to know Matthew from way back when. We happened to cross paths when I was at the Walters. So it's been really delightful to have him have a peek at our collection, and then also to have the pleasure of hearing him come to speak to us tonight. So let me tell you a little bit more about him. At the Fowler, he's actually responsible for an incredible array of different cultures, ancient, traditional, and contemporary cultures of Africa, Native, and Latin America, and Asia, and the Pacific. So people shouldn't complain when they feel as though they're overburdened with too many areas of specialization, like myself. He also held positions at the De Young and also at the St. Louis Art Museum. And most recently, he curated the exhibition that I can't pronounce. Thank you. City of Water, City of Fire, which traveled to LACMA and the Phoenix Art Museum. He did his undergrad work at Princeton, and he's got a master's from UT Austin and a PhD from Yale. And he worked at the Walters and the Princeton University Art Museum as well. And he's lectured on a broad range of topics in the indigenous arts of the Western Hemisphere. And he was also a scholar in residence at the Getty in 2015. So with that, help me welcome him to the stage, and he will take questions after his talk.
Thanks. Well, thank you all for coming and for choosing Pre-Columbian art over pop-up opera. I appreciate it. It's been really fun to be here and to see a little bit more of the collection and the really great Ramos Martinez show. I encourage you all to check that out as well. And I'm relatively new to Southern California. I've been here for about 3.5 years now. And so like some of you who have been interested in pre-Columbian art for a long time, it's like you may know parts of this story already. But as Ike said, happy to field questions as we go through this talk. What's that? Oh, let's see. Oh. See if I can get it to go forward. I'm trying. Let's see. It worked not too long ago. Oh, wait, maybe I can do it this way. How about that? Yes, okay, we're good. So when we're talking about MacGuffins, how many of you know what a MacGuffin is when we're talking about the movies? Okay, I've got a couple of folks there. So if you had to define a MacGuffin, how would you do it?
It's a plot device which doesn't really come out of the story except that it's useful to move it along.
Right, like that's the, it is the thing that moves the plot forward. And it usually is a thing. It's usually a small something, it's a portable something. And so basically, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's just the thing that moves the story forward. And so one of the most famous ones, of course, is the Maltese Falcon from John Huston's 1941 film of the same name. Huston will come back into the story, so just hang on to him for a second. But it's also really funny that when you're researching the MacGuffin and the Maltese Falcon and things like that, now there's actually kind of a whole set of stories about the props that were actually used in the Maltese Falcon, and if somebody actually has the authentic Maltese Falcon prop. So there's always this kind of set of obsessions that can come up in a movie, and it's always about these sort of like small portable objects in many cases. So that's what a MacGuffin is. This is a talk that I developed for a project that resulted in this book, LA Collects LA, Latin America in Southern California Collections, edited by Jesse Lerner and Ruben Ortiz Torres. It was one of the projects that was part of the Getty's Pacific Standard Time initiative a couple of years ago. And so it really is an attempt on my part to try to understand different parts of how the market for pre-Columbian art developed in mid-century. And until relatively recently, there hasn't been a whole lot of work on the history of collecting pre-Columbian art in the United States. Except for one very significant essay by Michael Coe from 1993, From Vaquero to Connoisseur, the early market in pre-Columbian art. And so he looked at the market from an anthropological perspective. Like he was trying to understand all of these different roles, trying to understand how objects moved and circulated without a whole lot of moral judgment. Mike was a part of this network as an expert, and so he was interested in trying to kind of come up with a more rigorous way of looking at it. And so he outlined this three-part model of production, distribution, and consumption, and sort of trying to understand where the different roles or tasks, that people could take would fall along that line from a pyramid to a museum in a major metropolitan area. And so one of the things that's really important to point out in this regard is like this consumption part destroys these temples. Like the looting of these objects for this market has caused incredible and irreversible damage to the archaeological record and thus to our understanding of the ancient past. And it's equally important, I think, to recognize that this consumption is an elite behavior, largely carried out by citizens in the United States and European countries. But it's also important to remember that there are members of the elite in Latin American countries, places like Mexico and Guatemala and Peru, who also are forming their own pre-Columbian collections. And in many cases, those people all knew each other. They knew each other as collectors. They knew each other through these kinds of networks. Make sure I got everything there. There we go. And so it's important in this regard to sort of understand that pre-Columbian art as such didn't really form part of U.S. art museum collections until after World War II. And it typically happened under the rubric of what you've probably heard described as primitive arts, or tribal arts, things like that. Shelley Arrington has defined the high watermarks for collecting primitive art as the foundation, on the one hand, of the Museum of Primitive Art in 1954, and so that's you see it in its location in Midtown Manhattan, and the 1984 Museum of Modern Art exhibition, Primitivism in 20th Century Art. Now, there's a real physical and social connection between the Museum of Primitive Art in the 1950s and 60s and MoMA and that same time period. The MPA is on 15 West 54th Street, so it is literally right behind MoMA. And that underscores these links that they have just in terms of their administrations. So most of the Museum of Primitive Art's collections, which are now at the Met, that's another story, came from the collection of Nelson Rockefeller, who was also the board president of the Museum of Primitive Art, and René Darnancourt, who actually advised Rockefeller on many of his purchases, served as the board's vice president. And so both of them were also active in similar capacities at MoMA, where Rockefeller was also on the board and René Darnancourt was director. And so that gives you some idea of just how closely aligned these two institutions were. And this is how we start to get this modernist and primitive the relationship between the two. The narrative arc was pretty well rehearsed by the 1980s, by the time of this exhibition. As constructed by MoMA, it was a very, I'm just going to give a very simplified version, that, you know, artists like Pablo Picasso in the early part of the 20th century are tapping into something like an intuitive, quote-unquote, intuitive primitivity. So they see an affinity between African masks that they see at places like the Trocadero in Paris, and the radical aesthetic forms that they want to create. So they want to sort of use that those formal models in a new way. And so the discovery in this regard of primitive art was a key moment in the move from realism in Western art to abstraction. And modernism, in this sense, needed primitive art to justify its reformulation of basic aesthetic principles, and primitive art, quote unquote, needed the legitimizing patina of modernism to make the transition from the merely ethnographic to the truly beautiful. There are a lot of problems with that, as you can probably imagine. But objects from the ancient Americans are some of the ways that we start to understand how problematic that narrative is, because it doesn't quite fit. They've always had an complicated and uncomfortable place in this system. So you get departments of arts of the Americas and Africa and Oceania, and it's like, what do these three places have to do with each other? And this has been something that various authors have noted over the years. And MoMA, in fact, had an exhibition in 1933 called American Sources of Modern Art. And so they have this sort of a drawing of a Maya relief on the cover of the book. And the curator, Holger Cahill, stressed that there was, quote, no intention here to insist that ancient American art is a major source of modern art. And then you're kind of looking at the title of the book and you're thinking, well, what are you doing then? So his introduction goes on to actually describe how, after returning from Paris in the early years of the 20th century, American painters, quote unquote, began to study collections of Mexican and Peruvian art in the American Museum of Natural History in New York. So they're doing that same thing. Like Picasso goes to the Trocadero. These artists are like, oh, okay, I'll go to the Natural History Museum. I'll go to the Anthropology Museum. So American Sources of Modern Art as an exhibition mixed contemporary paintings with Maya Stele on the first floor. The other two had smaller sculptures and gold objects and textiles. And Cahill, like, he actually doesn't call this art primitive. He recognizes the time difference that he's dealing with, and you know, the other kinds of ways that you could look at this. So he was trying in a way to get to some kind of, just trying to get to the rest of my notes here. Oh, there we go. Now I've gone to too many slides. He understood that this grouping of of this material with other kinds of quote unquote primitive arts was a problem. The other model that MoMA also proposed was through the model that you see in 20 centuries of Mexican art, which basically goes from pre-Columbian art all the way to Mexican modernism as it was understood in the 1940s. And so that was a different kind of way to present ancient art as a source of a national tradition, rather than ancient American art as a source of like a way to innovate formally in modern art. It really doesn't want to let me click. So one of the really interesting things about the 20 Centuries of Mexican Art show was just how diverse the sort of curatorial team was. So someone like Miguel Covarrubias, who you see right here, caricaturing him himself, he actually curated the modern section of the show, and Alfonso Caso, a Mexican archaeologist, curated the archaeology section. But in addition to doing that curatorial work, Covarrubias also made this drawing, watercolor, for Vogue, as a way of commemorating the opening festivities. And so you see a little bit, so here's Stieglitz and George O'Keeffe, there's Greta Garbo, Edward G. Robinson, this is Frank Croninshield, that's Alfred Barr, Hedy Lamarr, I think. so Croninshield was a writer, cultural figure, writing for Vogue, writing for Vanity Fair, and so he actually reviewed the show, and he compared or he contrasted the Coatlicue that you see here, this big Aztec sculpture. That actually the sculpture itself wasn't included in the MoMA show; it was included as a cast. But nonetheless, Croninshield sort of called attention to the sort of the violence and the savagery that he saw in this image, which is a female Aztec deity, and he compared it quite directly to Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, and saying that this is far more frightening, quote unquote, than the Demoiselle d'Avignon. And so this is how you start to get a sense of who's interested in pre-Columbian art in the early 1940s, and then particularly in the post-war period, and how the indigenous arts of the Americas came to serve a number of different purposes culturally and aesthetically. In 1943, we see the so-called Amerindian number of Wolfgang Paulin's Dien, which was an important art and design journal in the 1940s. Paulin was an Austrian expat, and he had left France for Mexico in 1939. And so Dien, this journal, served as a vehicle for his own theoretical writings, as well as other articles on a broad range of topics from ethnography, archaeology, abstraction, and surrealism. And the magazine had an enormous influence on cultural and artistic circles in Mexico and the United States and Europe. And this was in fact a double issue there that you see, 4 and 5. So Paulin himself wrote on art from the Northwest Coast. Alfonso Caso, that I mentioned to you earlier, he wrote on pre-Columbian codices or manuscripts from Oaxaca. Covarrubias wrote on ceramic figurines from Tlatilco. Martin Chiambi, a famous photographer, he had photos of Cusco in Peru, and so this is again these artists and intellectuals and scholars are trying to come up with a systematic way of presenting the indigenous arts of the Americas, from ancient to the 19th century material that Paulin was interested in from the Northwest Coast to contemporary photography. And you see here the quote in the center. I'm not going to read that all the way through. But it gives you an idea of what Paulin and some of the people who were affiliated with him saw as the integrative power of these kinds of art forms, and how they could be related to other modern art forms, and how they could also serve other kinds of social and spiritual purposes. So one of Dien's distributors in the United States was the Wakefield Gallery in New York. This is a gallery run by Betty Parsons, and they actually sponsored several exhibitions of indigenous American art in the 1940s. It usually was better known for its exhibitions of emerging abstract artists, and in fact, it was one of those artists, Barnett Newman, who in mid-1944 curated a show of pre-Columbian art at the gallery's West 55th Street space. So again, like we're in a really small area of Midtown Manhattan here. The objects on view were drawn from collections at the Museum of Natural History, as well as other private collections, including pieces that belong to William Spratling and Miguel Covarrubias, and Aaron Siskind actually did the photography for the catalog. And so this is still, we're in the realm of this still, this very sort of like small network of people who all sort of know each other. This is an individual who's a key player in this kind of primitive art circle. He's got a lot of the same kind of very sort of like integrative ideas about the potentiality of primitive art, so-called primitive art. A guy named John D. Graham, he has a whole very colorful history. And again, this is a text from Barnett Newman that he wrote for this catalog, which again, they are looking for a way to integrate these art forms in this moment in the 1940s as a way of sort of understanding a different kind of what Newman called an inter-American consciousness. So, by the end of World War II, sort of in that moment in the 1930s and 40s, there's a certain set of people they're intellectuals, artists, call them what you will, who are for them collecting pre-Columbian art had this certain cachet. It signified to them this kind of potentiality for spiritual consciousness and things like that. But it really wasn't a mass phenomenon. This is a really restricted area, really restricted group of people, spatially, socially, all of that. And it really there's not a whole lot of opportunity for you as a museum goer to see this kind of material in public collections in the United States. Not very many museums are devoting a lot of room to this material in their permanent collection galleries. So it takes a different network of different players, dealers and collectors and museum supporters to really transform the market for pre-Columbian art in the post-war period. And it took a different kind of presentation, and one that more people could consume rather than these really restricted art journals and art galleries. And it really needs to happen in movies and in newspapers and magazines. So this is where we get into the MacGuffin with Alfred Hitchcock. As we were talking about before, Hitchcock has this famous interview with Francois Truffaut. In Crook Stories, the MacGuffin is almost always the necklace. In Spy Stories, it is almost always the papers. And so he says that his best MacGuffin, and by that I mean the emptiest, the most non-existent, the most absurd, is the one that we used in North by Northwest. And so you see it there on the left. How many of you see North by Northwest? That's good. Okay. Really, everybody should see it multiple times. Now I have really done it. Oh, yeah, we're good. So in the screenplay, Ernest Lehman wrote the screenplay, and he identifies this as a West Mexican sculpture. He misspells Colima, and it's we're in Chicago at this point in the movie, and it's in an auction house, and the collector is identified only as Orlando Mendoza. And from what we know as scholars and consumers of images and information about these kinds of objects, it's like this is supposed to be a pre-Columbian ceramic sculpture from West Mexico. Sort of give it 200 BC to 200 AD. That's what you would have understood this object to be. And objects like this were being sold at auctions like this one, in Chicago, in LA, in New York, in the late 1950s when North by Northwest was made. So this is very plausible from that kind of cinematic perspective. But of course, you've all seen the movie. We learn, of course, that the sculpture, which is the MacGuffin of North by Northwest, contains the microfilm that contains an unspecified government's equally unspecified secrets. You never know who the good guys are or who the bad guys are in North by Northwest. You never learn whether or not Martin Landau is working for the U.S. government or the Soviets or some other government. You never really know what exactly is going on, and that is, in fact, part of the fun of the movie, of course. And the status of the object as a forged object that contains the microfilm is only fully revealed at the film's climax when they're trying to get away on Mount Rushmore, and it breaks and it reveals the microfilm. And so that the object's status as a forgery really underscores the screenplay's emphasis on performance and authenticity and all of the shifting roles that are played by its characters. So that's the best MacGuffin. And so that's the kind of thing that leads me on a hunt for the presentation of pre-Columbian art in other movies. And they're not really MacGuffins in this context. They're not driving the plot forward, but they're there in the background, authentic and otherwise. They're in the background of Rope in the apartment of the two murderers. You can see a couple of different pre-Columbian and Aztec sculptures sort of lying around. Most of you have probably seen Rope, but how many of you have seen Marnie? This is a little late in the game. Okay, good. So you remember the beginning scene of Marnie where she actually meets Sean Connery for the first time, and there's this kind of weird, pathetic fallacy of the storm that breaks out, and it comes in and it breaks the window and it knocks over the Pre-Columbian collection that Sean Connery's character then talks about having belonged to his late wife. And so, you get Veracruz, you get central Mexico, you get some Colombian gold in there. But it lets you think that it's just an obsession of Hitchcock. There's also, Aztec sculpture sort of popping up in How to Marry a Millionaire, even TV shows like Batman. Oh, let me go back to that one. But probably my favorite one of all is 1958's Bell, Book, and Candle. How many of you seen that one? Okay, this is a good crowd. Okay. Do you remember that Kim Novak, she plays a Wellesley alumna who's turned primitive art dealer, and she's also a secret witch, so we get into that kind of role reversal thing, to Jimmy Stewart's straight man. The Carlebach Gallery, which was well known in the 1950s for its promotion of modern American art, was equally involved in selling so-called primitive art. And in fact, they provided the objects for the movie's, her gallery in the movie. So that's where we're seeing Pre-Columbian art presented. That's where people are kind of coming to understand it at a mass level. There must be others. I'm always on the lookout. Somebody tells me when Perry Mason goes color that there's an episode where there's some Pre-Columbian art in that. There's another great LA movie called The Inside Man where there's actually a kind of a mafia hit job at a house in Beverly Hills, and there's some Pre-Columbian art in that as well. Most of the time they are really kind of blink or you'll miss it, kind of background details, but they're there, and they're pretty consistent. And they signify, in some cases, I think for me, a kind of authenticity, that they make characters seem more genuinely wealthy, more genuinely knowledgeable, perhaps slightly more worldly or eccentric than they would be without these kind of exoticizing details. And somehow this is what makes the MacGuffin of North by Northwest so compelling. The object is presented as authentic, but it turns out to be fake. So this cinematic track largely parallels presentations in other media formats. So there's a whole series of newspaper articles in the 1950s and 60s that document how modern art and architecture are really need a little modern, primitive or tribal art to help sort of activate these clean, domestic urban apartments. And it was such a fad that by 1959, one collector in California could recall how inexpensive, quote unquote, primitive objects had been only a few years before. But there was, quote, an expensive vogue for things pre-Columbian that had raised prices. So one of the things that I've been working on over the last couple of months with a number of my colleagues is the archives of a very important gallery for Pre-Columbian art called the Stendall Gallery. Some of you may have heard of it. They were in business for around 100 years. They play a key role in this. But their archives were recently donated to the Getty Research Institute, and so we've been working through them. And one of the things that we found was a gigantic clippings file of advertisements like the ones that I was just showing you. Modernist apartments, advertisements for them, and Pre-Columbian art sort of cropping up in unexpected places. So true modern art helps you, or true modern helps you control clutter. So Marie Kondo, it's not a new thing. But if you look very closely on that coffee table over there, you'll see an object that's very, very similar to this one. And as I was prepping for my trip, I realized that there's actually one here in Santa Barbara, and so it's quite possible that the one that's in this ad was something that the Stendall Gallery had placed in the ad, just as a kind of a marketing scheme, and then maybe I'll have to do some more digging through your files and the files at the Getty to figure out if this object might have actually been the one that was used for this campaign, and then the one that ended up here. There are a number of other possibilities. This is one that's at the Baltimore Museum of Art, but it gives you a sense of sort of like how this system could start working. And it's working in other contexts as well. Some of you may be familiar with the Kahlua advertising campaign that ran for many years that used West Mexican sculpture. Jules Berman, who was the owner, who was an advertising executive who organized this campaign, he had a huge collection of West Mexican sculpture. And so that was one of the synergies, as it were, that made this happen. And if I'll just point out, sort of like I asked you to hang on to John Huston before, like hang on to Vincent Price. He's also going to become a figure that we'll want to go back to. One of the other things that we found in the Stendall files is it's not just Kahlua ads, it's also recording equipment. Like, I wasn't expecting that. And it's also insurance. We have a pretty good idea of what some of these objects are, and some of them almost certainly came through Stendall's gallery. And so he's really leaving no marketing potentiality unturned, or no stone unturned. And this is really part of his whole scheme. And it really sort of comes to a peak in the mid-1960s. And this is a quote from a Saturday Evening Post article that gives you a really good sense of the scale and reach and sort of charismatic power that Stendall had cultivated amongst a quite notable set of Hollywood actors, directors, and producers. Excuse me. And so this was one of Stendall's ways of sort of increasing the kind of the social and cultural cachet of collecting pre-Columbian art, was to make sure that you knew that Hollywood stars had collected this kind of material too. So it's a good way to sort of be like them. The person that's figured here is a really eccentric character named Billy Pearson, who also is a major figure in this. He becomes a dealer after he's been a jockey for a number of years, and so I'll talk about him more in a second. But one of the details about Stendall that I wanted to point out here, and this is in April Damon, who was part of the third generation of the family. She wrote an incredible biography of him. Describes how in 1957 he blustered his way onto the island of Haina, which is an island just off the coast of Campeche in Mexico, which is the source of a number of significant ceramic sculptures. And so Stendall, works his way onto the island. He's got dubious paperwork that authorizes him and his crew to shoot a documentary about archaeological excavation. And so he doesn't actually have any film in the camera. He's actually just having people dig the objects out, and that's how objects from Haina ended up in Stendall's hands, and then ended up in well-established collections like Robert Woods Bliss at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., and Walter and Louise Annensberg in Los Angeles. And so that's the kind of network of actions that Stendall is involved in as well. Hollywood biographies often contain oblique references to pre-Columbian collections. Charles Lawton had a pool and a garden populated with Aztec sculptures. John Huston had a sort of a secret gallery in his basement. But beyond the ways in which these names continue to add a certain amount of patina and presumably financial value to individual objects, it's hard to discern exactly what was in a lot of these people's collections. We don't have complete catalogs or things like that. But some collectors, figures like Dalton Trumbo, Vincent Price, John Huston, they collected avidly enough that there are stories attached to their purchases that occasionally entered the realm of Hollywood legend. And they often had help. Billy Pearson, who you see here, again, is a jockey turned dealer who was one of John Huston's boon companions and would often join him on shoots in Mexico. And they would figure out they would do these kind of one-upmanships of like how much art could they smuggle out of the country. But there's another event that had a significant impact on the development of the market in pre-Columbian art in the 1950s, and that was the Hollywood Blacklist. And there were many participants in the film industry outside of just the Hollywood 10 who found the economic and social opportunities, their economic and social opportunities severely limited as a result of the blacklisting of Communist Party members and leftist sympathizers. Some, like George Pepper, who you see here on the left, took refuge in Mexico during the blacklist, and they actually actually became collectors and dealers and amateur scholars in their own right, and they created collections that had real impact on the museum collections that we see today. Pepper formed actually a film company called Olmec Productions, and he produced and wrote films, often with a pseudonym, Hugo P. Verker, to hide his identity, and including films with Luis Buñuel. And he, like other American and Mexican collectors living in the capital in the late 1950s and early 1960s, were sometimes compelled to donate objects, quote unquote, to Mexico's new National Museum in the early 1960s. This suggests that although Mexico is a welcoming environment for a lot of these people in a political and social sense, the Mexican government is well aware of what they're up to and is not afraid to sort of politely suggest that they should donate some of the objects that they've collected to the Mexican government. Pepper was good friends with Dalton Trumbo when Trumbo was exiled to Mexico City in the early 1950s. And they actually had an almost kind of competitive habit of collecting ceramic figurines from the brickyards of the Mexico City suburb of Tlatilco, where a generation before, Covarrubias and Rivera had enjoyed the exact same activity. So we can augment Mike Coe's model of the pre-Columbian art market and sort of like introduce some generalized placeholders for mass media, for the distribution of ideas about pre-Columbian art in movies and magazines and newspapers, and move that frontier maybe around a little bit, knowing that this is an activity that's happening on both sides of the border. We can also add another venue for distribution, which is to say the department store. So this is the May Company store at Wilshire and Fairfax. And in the summer of 1966, the May Company, just down the street from LACMA, and at that point, LACMA had moved just down the street to Wilshire, they had a sale of pre-Columbian art. The company's owner, Morton May, also known as Buster, was a well-known collector at the time, and he avidly promoted buying art of all kinds in his national chain of department stores. So these are a couple of ads. The May Company down there, the May Company Wilshire, advertising for a sale of Southeast Asian art. Famous bar in Clayton. Clayton is a suburb of St. Louis, where the May Company was headquartered. The famous bar store was kind of like their flagship store, and they were selling African art. And then these shows would go on the road. They would go to all of the other stores around the country. This was huge news to me when I found out. And then I'm asking other people, and they're like, oh yeah. Like I knew that. I went and shopped at that store, but it's still not part of our understanding, of how the field develops. And so, if you all have any stories like that, I would love to hear them. It's not just pre-Columbian art, as I was mentioning. It includes African art. Sometimes these sales actually seem to be taking place at the museum. This is a series of photographs that the May Company's publicist donated to the Missouri History Society. This is Buster May himself. I think this is actually happening in the museum because there's a very famous Max Beckmann painting that you can just sort of see hiding back there in the corner. And then, but they're, it's like they've got their famous bar bags. So there's a real kind of overlap in marketing and patronage. May was a member of the board of the St. Louis Art Museum as well. The May Company also sponsored an oceanic art giveaway at the Art Museum during a meeting of museum directors in St. Louis. So basically, you could walk out of the building with one red tag item, 2 blue tag items, 3 yellow tag items, things like that. And so for the pre-Columbian art sale in the summer of 1966, we've got the records now that have really established that much of the material in that sale / exhibition actually came from the Stendall galleries. It's still not quite clear what the financial arrangement was, whether this material was on consignment or what have you. May did buy things from other dealers to include in the sale. And then there's always a sort of a question about sort of like what happened to the material that didn't sell afterwards. Some of it May kept himself. Some of it was donated to the museum. Some of it he donated. Some of it the company donated. It's a complex set of object issues to resolve. But what's also really interesting, aside from the media coverage that this sale actually gets, is that about a month before, they had a so-called Mexican fiesta sale in which they were actually selling replicas of objects, like official replicas of objects, from the then recently reopened National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. So if you can imagine that in sort of like earlier in the spring, they're selling replicas of real objects from Mexico's national collection, and then a month later they're selling the real thing that's been looted, it gets a little confusing. These are these are the only photographs of the sale that I've been able to locate so far. I'm indebted to my colleague Victoria Lyle, who used to be at LACMA and is now at Denver, for sharing these. She found them in the archives at the Denver Art Museum. And so you see here Morton May and Alan Sawyer, who was a well-known specialist in Andean art and was at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C. He basically vetted or authenticated the objects from the Andes for the sale. H.B. Nicholson, who was a professor of Aztec art at UCLA, vetted the Mesoamerican section, and they kind of split the difference on the material from Central America. And there were some interesting letters about their decisions about that. Jimmy Economos, who you see here on the right, actually started out working at the Carlebach Gallery that I mentioned before, associated with Bell Book and Candle. And May was a regular client of Carlebach's, and so basically kind of, recruited Economos to come and work for him and run his fine art shows. Economos eventually leaves, the May Company and becomes a very well-known Native American art dealer in his own right. And so this just gives you a sense of just how small and closely knit this network actually was. So May knew all of these people. He knew Vincent Price from their school days in St. Louis. They went to high school together. He bought regularly, as we've talked about, from Stendall, and he actually ends up buying George Pepper's inventory from his widow when George Pepper dies in 1968. And so all of whatever George Pepper had left at that point came to Maine, came to St. Louis. He bought objects from Billy Pearson, John Huston's companion, who you see here with two Veracruz, quote-unquote, ceramic sculptures. At one point, they belonged to the Texas collector, Ted Weiner, and then at some point, Pearson probably sells them, and we know that he sells them to John Huston. But there's a bit of a complicated story behind these three objects. In 1987, a resident of Veracruz named Brigido Lara actually claimed to have made these three objects and many, many other similar objects attributed to Veracruz in U.S. collections. So the Metropolitan Museum gets wrapped up in this. Morton May's collection in St. Louis gets wrapped up in this. And so we basically, Brigido Lara has kind of said that he made all of these objects, and so in many cases, the museums have reclassified them as 20th century forgeries. And so the background history of these objects actually includes this kind of incredible sort of urban legend where Pearson actually has a film of the objects being excavated, and he shows it to, he screens that film for people in a back room at the Cock and Bull, which was a sort of a nightclub restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. But if the sculptures in the film are fake, then the film must be suspect as well. And so it's kind of like, I can't really get my head around a filmmaker like John Huston, sort of like maybe he sees this film and he's like, oh, I have to have these things. They must be real. I'm seeing a movie of them. It's a really weird thing for a film director to think. And that's that kind of strange realm that we're in when Hitchcock uses a fake Pre-Columbian sculpture that contains really fictional film as his best MacGuffin. Pearson has a movie of illicit excavations, but both the excavations and the figures in them are probably forgeries. Pepper uses a pseudonym to make real movies while selling and lending and donating real works of Pre-Columbian art to the National Museum of Anthropology, as well as other museums and donors. Stendall Stendall creates a fake film crew and a documentary to carry out illicit excavations of real objects. And then a department store magnate can sell replicas and authentic objects within weeks of each other. So this is the spectrum of behaviors that we're trying to see when we're looking at the ways in which pre-Columbian art is imagined and consumed at this period. Public to private, official to clandestine, and all of the gray areas in between. Thank you. Sure. Yeah.
How come you didn't use the Frank Lloyd Wright houses as examples in this document?
I mean, so the Frank Lloyd Wright houses are a particular favorite, and they're a sort of a kind of a different direction in terms of sort of like thinking about the ways in which that kind of imagery is used in that kind of architectural and decorative way. But I'm really like, and he wasn't, as far as I've been able to determine, necessarily a collector of this material himself. So I've really been focusing on the collectors and sort of like how they understand it. But I love that stuff. And it's, and I do keep track of where the Ennis House appears in movies as well. So. Yeah.
When you're talking about historiography, I was thinking about somebody like George Kubler, The Shape of Time. That was part of that whole breaking apart of the kind of Western canon at the same time.
And Vincent Price and George Kubler were close college pals, and that comes up. Kubler's an interesting figure in that regard. In this, he really he wrote actually for the Ahrensburg collection catalog that included a lot of material that Stendall had sold. I was lucky enough to talk to Michael Coe about Kubler, and Mike would always be like, he had a wooden eye. That Kubler really didn't get the art part. In the way that these connoisseurs and collectors did, and The Shape of Time remains a really sort of difficult text to grapple with. There's a lot about it that's super appealing, but there's also there's a way in which I've read it a bunch, but there's a way in which in the end he likes to deny agency from people who are making things, that makes it a more difficult text for me to sort of continue sort of using and thinking about when I think about pre-Columbian art. So.
Anybody else? No? Thank you so much. It was really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.